Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And with me today is a reduced summer crew because most people, I guess, are on vacation. We have Murray Dom, the assistant editor, and Mark DeSantis. Today we're going to discuss the latest issue of the magazine, issue 103, which is all about the Bronze Age. We picked kind of big topic, probably, if chronologically speaking, the biggest we could have picked for ancient warfare, since we probably won't ever go into the Neolithicum. Or but this, depending on which culture you're looking at, we're talking, roughly 2,000 years of ancient history. And we were sort of having our pre-discussion for this podcast to decide how we were going to handle this. And Murray suggested we could talk about, what do historians talk about? Continuity and change. What are the big themes that what comes up in the Bronze Age and what changes and what seems to stay the same? And one of the things we noticed was a certain continuity in weaponry. Obviously, there's actually, the one that we're going to forget probably is spears, because that's probably the most continuous one of all of ancient history and then medieval history into the early modern age, really. Just the difference of exactly what kind of pointy bit you stick on it and how long it is, but otherwise that stays the same, which it perhaps should be a theme sometime, the spear.
Yeah,
Lots of
it's
long, thin
amazing
pictures.
the elasticity of the spear that we love to talk about a standard length of a spear, but to remember, of course, this is not a weights and measures is something that comes in. Hammurabi, I think, introduces standardized weights and measures. And each Greek state had a different weight and measure system. So this idea of, these spears from this culture are this length, you're like, who knew? I doubt they were measuring them. They were making a shaft and putting a blade on it. So they would be presumably roughly the same length, but they're certainly not going to be exactly the same length. Much like all of these different spearheads we find, they are within some parameters the same length, but they're never the same. And so I think that one of the things about continuity, of course, is, as you just pointed out, continuity keeps getting missed. When things never change, you're like, wow, that's interesting. That never changes. But that's boring because it never changes. But the spear is omnipresent from the very beginnings of warfare in Sumer all the way through to even now. I was just reading in a wargaming magazine about the usefulness of the bamboo spear squad in bolt action, which is like ridiculous. But that the spears get longer in certain cultures. We've got some Mycenaean frescoes in this issue of long speared Mycenaean era Greek warriors. And again, the spear in Greek culture then shortens and then gets longer again under the Macedonians and Hellenistic period. So that's always there. A sharp, pointy end, whether it be bone or bronze or iron, on the end of a stick, is for some reason one of the longest serving weapons. Although, is it the bow? Maybe it's the bow. Because that's the other thing, of course, in a lot of these cultures, is that the bow and arrow are present in all of their forms and all of their revolutions throughout warfare. But we have Bronze Age warfare very early, probably along with the spear, because they are hunting weapons first. So you've got the bow, the arrow, the spear, the sling, and the other thing we were mentioning just off camera. What could we talk about? Was the axe. Now, I think the other thing about the axe, which does disappear from warfare, is that those tools are multiform tools. They are hunting tools. They are working tools who then get used in warfare. And so, in a way, that's completely understandable. And then the axe is that interesting one where it goes out probably to be replaced by the sword. Don't come after me for saying that. But the sword appears as a warfare weapon. It's not used in other contexts. It's a warfare status weapon.
Similar to the mace, I think, isn't Hamblin? which I read a long time ago, who makes that point that the appearance of the mace is for him a marker of this is where warfare really begins because nobody's going to hunt with a mace.
Yeah, well, and daggers too. Daggers too are tools that you sit in your belt and you can use for multiple things. They become weapons, but they're actually also tools. But yeah, I think the mace, the sword. What else are warfare only weapons? I don't know. I think it's those two. And of course, the funny thing about those is that they then become ritualized, symbolic emblems of power. But it's a militaristic
Yeah, but on the other
status.
hand, for the Assyrians, it's still the bow and arrow, which is the symbol of power, and that's and of course, and the Assyrian kings and the Babylonian kings are constantly depicted both, on the battlefield with their bow and arrow and the chariot, and hunting lions with the exact same weaponry.
Yes, and again, speaking continuity past the Bronze Age again, it's the Derrick, it's the Persian, you know, emblem of kingship is the archer, and again that link to hunting. It's amazing how those things, because we love to put things in ages, and the idea that the Bronze Age collapse is followed by a Dark Age, which is then replaced by a Classical Age, where the idea, of course, is that everything disappears and then everything is found anew. Whereas the reality is, even in that Dark Age where we don't have evidence, life continued. People didn't know they were in a new age. It's a bit like being in the modern age, where we've had so many ages since the 1980s, so many generations. One of the things that really bothers me in my conversations with my daughters, Gen Y, which once upon a time was the next generation. No one even mentions poor old Gen Y today. It goes Gen X, millennials. You're like, what about Gen Y? What happened to Gen Y? Who are Gen Y? Like, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of people who've been forgotten. And so that idea of like, well, we've all just lived our lives and life has continued and evolved. And, we've now got these devices in our hands that we didn't have 30 years ago, but they're still called phones. They still, do phony things. But that continuity of life, and you imagine if you're at the end of the Bronze Age collapse, you're still going to live. You've still got your spear. You've still got your
Hopefully,
armor.
yeah.
Well, yeah. Well. We wouldn't be here if they didn't. So, but all of those things continue with change embedded in them. But they wouldn't necessarily think that they were in a new age. And we come along as historians and archaeologists, and we compartmentalize it because it's far easier to understand. Even a 2,000-year-old long period is easier to understand than here is all of human history. Go.
Following on with the idea of continuity and change, the the standard thesis is that in the Bronze Age, warfare was the realm of an elite group who could actually afford bronze weapons because bronze was scarce. Copper and tin were scarce, which is what you needed to make bronze. And only the very well off could afford them, especially if you were going for high status weapons and the panoply of armor that you would need to encase yourself in. Whereas with iron, which comes to the very end of the Bronze Age and gives its name to the succeeding age, the Iron Age, is more plentiful, and iron was known during the Bronze Age, but just was not used as much. Ushered in an era of, I would get, let's say, a more egalitarian period of warfare in which more people could actually afford the weapons to equip themselves with some form of maybe sword, spears. They still used bronze. The Greeks wore bronze helmets and other forms of Greek armor. Does that thesis hold up in your minds? Because it would seem to me that bronze never became anything more than an elite weapon, especially when you're talking about something like a sword where you would need a lot of it and there's no use for it beyond fighting.
I think I think I read somewhere that the reason that iron is not used in that period is the smelting technology isn't good enough, or the fires are not hot enough to make it to forge it well, and there's not the technology to make steel and add things in, so that's happening. But there's still iron weapons, and I mean in Egypt there's copper weapons which exist far longer than and elsewhere because they've got plentiful copper but not tin. And so bronze, and I don't believe that these days we accept the idea that it's the the Hyksos. Was it the Hyksos or the Hittites? I'm getting mixed up with my movies. I'm thinking of the Egyptian. Am I thinking of the Egyptian?
I don't know.
Where
What's the point you're trying to make? Maybe
oh
that
well,
can
the
be.
who introduces you're talking like my family. Where are we, Murray? What are we talking about? Who introduces bronze technology to Egypt, and that technology doesn't even embed itself because it's so scarce. And I think there's a really interesting thing. So in the issue, we talk about the Battle of Tollens, which is 1340 BC in northern Germany, and there's evidence there of a battle over a river, and between a bronze armed contingent and a contingent armed with bone and sharpened wood weapons. So there's a really interesting contrast there of new technology coming in. And, it's touted as the oldest battlefield in Europe. And it's also a very interesting example to disprove the theory of certain parts of Bronze Age culture around Europe being pacifistic and saying, no, there was no war. And here it suddenly is like, no, this is definitely evidence of large scale war at a period. And so that idea is really interesting because you've got this evidence, irrefutable evidence of warfare, because when those discoveries were first made in the 90s, there was ritual and cemetery. But then they're like, yes, but there's no other cemetery goods. It doesn't match ritual burial anywhere else. It's bodies in a riverbed with wounds consistent with battle wounds. And so as the consensus has shifted to say, oh, it's definitely a battle, and more finds have been made over a 3-kilometer stretch of the river, oh, it's a big battle. Oh, it's an enormous battle. It's the biggest battle we've got. It's the largest battlefield. You're like, oh, okay, this is all getting messed up. But that idea of warrior culture and warfare being important and evolving in this age, regardless of where in Europe, the Near East, which is an enormous span of cultures and time. Why is all that happening at roughly the same time in this era? Are we fighting over resources? People will talk about climate change, which of course is a very topical conversation today, but people get triggered by it because they don't want to talk about it in the modern age, and therefore they look at people throwing that phrase around, which was always thrown around when you look at, migrations of people, climate change, or population pressure, which are phrases that are just thrown into debates, and you're like, well, but what does that mean? Who, where, what? Glaciation. You're like, oh, interesting. So all of it's fascinating because you get this emergence of warrior cultures and therefore professional armies. And I think the first evidence of a professional army is Sargon with 5,600 men at breakfast, that's a big breakfast, people. So that's a legion. I mean that completely off topic, Murray. That number 5,600, you're like, hang on a minute, that's a legion from a much later age.
But yeah, but it's important to remember that this is Sargon. This is the first Sargon, not the Assyrian one that everyone thinks of. So this is like
earlier,
2100 BC.
Yes, Sargon of Akkad.
So it's interesting that it's a far wider debate about how warfare and comes up in this era, and because it forms an elite, you get the elites become important, and that causes kingship and therefore sort of early states to appear. And then, because as you mentioned, Mark, you need those resources, and then you get later on, certainly you get states that get bigger and they need to feed their elites and their armies, so they go on a conquest to feed more conquests. You get that kind of situation going on, which has been argued also for Rome, but also for Assyria, which are both, of course, Neo-Assyria anyway, Iron Age cultures.
And in mainland Greece at this time, this was the era of the palace economies, where the palace itself was the center of trade and I'll call it industrial production, for lack of a better term, where you could at least have all of the various activities of at least the local economy centered, which I don't see Egypt as being a palace-centered economy in the same way. I think it was more advanced, it was more widespread, but certainly, mainland Greece was like, and they were able to maintain a very advanced military. The Achaeans were well equipped, and I also noticed that with the Achaeans, over the roughly 500-year period between, let's say, the early Mycenaean age. I'm sorry, I'm calling them the Achaeans, but all of the various names that you might have for the Mycenaeans in that era, roughly 1600 to 1100 BC. They went from a period where they had heavy infantry with tower shields or figure of eight shields, but with two-handed spears, long two-handed spears, who appear to, from the frescoes, have fought in something of a line. Whereas by the end of that period, so let's say the 12th, 13th, 12th centuries, they looked more like a version of a hoplite. Now, I'm using that word very, very loosely, but you had a roundish shield, shortish spear, but still, not a very short spear, not a javelin, and body armor, helmet. Did that reflect a change in warfare? Was it a looser formation? Probably it was a looser formation. Maybe it was more conducive to piratical raids. It's difficult to say.
I mean, that's the other thing about continuity and the ubiquity across this entire age is the ubiquity of the shield, whatever shape and size it is, and the helmet, not armor. Armor is an interesting one because armor isn't necessarily present in all these cultures all the time. It does, the cover of the magazine issue is the Dendra panoply, famously, the 11 interlocking plates of bronze, which, make this knight of bronze armor, heavily armored, clearly elite, clearly expensive. Very few of the people on the battlefield are even going to have that, but it becomes a symbolic of this is the age of that warrior. And I think the fascinating thing about that, again, is these cultures. So I was thinking when you were saying palace culture, interestingly, of course, in Anatolia at this time, you've got city culture, whether it be or Babylon or Assur or Hattusha, whether I'm saying the Hittite capital's name correctly. All of these cities which have palaces in them, and then you've got palace culture in Greece. But in Egypt, when you've got Narmer founding Memphis as a capital with a palace, but because of the Nile, you've got an interesting and a unique binder of the culture. That yes, there are two cataracts of the Nile, which Narmer, of course, then combines, famously combining the two crowns of Egypt. So therefore, he has the Lower Nile and the Upper Nile crown, which of course is important in ongoing Egyptian history. But the idea that the Nile unites in Egypt, no other culture in the Mediterranean or Europe really has that. You can't do that with the Rhine. You can't do that with the Danube. You could maybe do it with the Tiber. I suppose you could. You could argue that that's what Rome is with Rome and Ostia. It's a culture.
It's a lot shorter river.
It's a lot shorter river. But that idea of this, it's always amazing when you're talking about the Near Eastern conflict along the Euphrates, and you do get Euphrates and Tigris Valley cultures later. But the idea of how close together some of these cities are that are actually independent cultures first, and then one is defeated by another, and then they become united. But when you actually look at the cluster of Sumer, Babylon, they're very close together. And I think the other thing that's fascinating in all this is the thing that becomes a symbol of these warrior elites, these elites. And I'm thinking here, to preempt myself, I'm thinking chariots. It's understandable in Egyptian Near Eastern warfare with large flat spaces why chariots and why they become important arms to armies before the rise of cavalry, in the next age. But Greece makes no sense for chariots. Makes like the terrain.
Well, similarly as Greece makes sense to have, or little sense to have, your battles being large, solid formations.
Obviously, Homer later solidifies the elite warrior kingly aristocratic status of the chariot, regardless of how the chariot's used. We don't need to get into the debate about, is it a battlefield taxi, is it a pre-modern tank, is it a transport of soldiers, is it an archery platform? Because it can actually be all those things. I was just doing some work on the next age in Chinese warfare, where the chariot lasts a lot longer, and then Iron Age Britain and Iron Age Gaul. The Celts used chariots a lot longer. But in this age, you've got chariots everywhere, even in cultures that you're like, where are you using this chariot? And the 37 meters from here to there, because that's the only place where the chariot can fit. And
perhaps it was just a status symbol. I mean, this is the Greeks were still part of that world.
Perhaps that.
No.
It was, and this is what high status warriors.
And I think that's the fascinating thing, is that yes, this is what high status warriors, what high status cultures have. You must have chariots. You've got to show us your chariot force. I've got a chariot force in Crete. You're like, woohoo! But
you must be a king, therefore. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And you can, coming into the modern age, look at the age of sail, look at the age of the dreadnought. To be counted as one of the big rulers, you had to have that. Even if you were like, you are bankrupting your economy by building dreadnoughts, don't compete in the dreadnought stakes. But the thing is, I'm thinking far too modern. If you don't build those, you are behind. If you look at the Battle of Tsushima, Japan has dreadnoughts, and they fight a wooden navy of Russia in 1905 that gets annihilated by this new technology. And so Russia, which was, a huge monarchy, is suddenly, they're backward. They're not up to scratch in how we define who you are. And so a Mycenaean Wanax having chariots does place them in you're a powerful king because you've got 2,000 chariots and this many arrows. It's a really interesting, and I know, Mark, you wanted to talk about Kadesh, the largest chariot battle in the ancient world, which is a status. This is how many chariots I have.
If we can think that the story that we have of Kadesh is in any way reliable, because we really only have one side of that. And the one thing about Kadesh is that that always stands out, that doesn't get as much comment as you might think, is that the entirety of the Hittite army was able to hide behind Kadesh from Ramses and the Egyptian army. And, I wonder how they failed to reconnoiter around the entirety of the city just to see what was there. But
which was not the size of modern London.
No, it was not. It was actually, relatively simple thing.
It's also one of those suggestions about how big are armies are we talking about? Oh, tens of thousands of men. So hang on a plain behind one city mound, the entire army can hide successfully. Can't be that big then.
and with horses and all sorts of other animals that had to be kept quiet. I guess that's how
one
did
of
that
the things.
work?
One of the articles in the issue pointed out that when Assyrian armies were on the march, they don't use the horses to march with the chariot. They use donkeys, and the horses are marched separately, and then they put them together. So there's an extra set of animals, towing crews, basically, for each chariot. And then you've got the famous depiction of the Egyptian chariots that are so lightweight that they're being transported on shoulders of men. That just doesn't fit with our idea of the chariot. They're so light that you can hoist one on your shoulder and carry it.
And then you go even more, like, which battlefield have you had raked and graded so that you can basically land an airplane on there, so it's that smooth, so that you can actually use your lightweight chariots, because if there's one large rock and the chariot goes plonk, and there goes the king.
Yeah, can you imagine the people always talk about, how do these armies actually even agree to fight? Is there like a understood meeting over here? And you're like, well, actually, yes, There is. It's not always random. It's not serendipitous. It's deliberate. And this is how we prove our status. And, they aren't necessarily particularly bloody battles, but they kind of have, they can be, but they also have kind of key indicators of, oh, you're defeated now. Now you're my vassal. You need to remain loyal to me for however long. But then there's the right now we're going to prepare the battlefield. You can imagine the two sides battle preparation teams, for lack of a better term, raking the battlefield, picking out the rocks so that they get we're going to have a game of rugby over there. Okay, well, we'll go and make a rugby field and we'll get rid of all those rocks out of the field so that we have a good game of rugby. And you're like, well, it is, that's quite flippant, but it actually is a little bit like that this is warrior culture personified, that you are selecting a field, you are deciding the rules, or in fact, the rules are actually already decided. And you then make the best case for this is where we can most enact out the ritual, for lack of a better term, of war. And that's fascinating. And all of this imagery that we get of the king and his chariot is this is what a king does, even if you're not a particularly good leader or warrior. You are depicted in this way, and you're always smiting enemies. Even if you never smote a single foe, you're always smiting enemies, riding over them.
I was reading something today that said that some of the very earliest depictions, like the Stele of the Vultures and such, the king isn't smiting. He's standing behind a deity, and they're doing the smiting. Because that's, of course, the other part that we didn't really address in this issue is that the enormous importance of religion. It's important at all times in the ancient world, of course. But certainly the earliest cities, that's the city of Ashur. That's the city where Ashur lives there. And, the next city over has its own god and they live there. And therefore, King A fights King B. King A fights on behalf of that deity, and the rules are probably set by the gods, and whether you're going to win or not depends on the mercy and the grace of the gods. And if you suddenly die, then there's something clearly was wrong.
Yeah, and then of course your victory is the victory of that deity over other deities, and you get the until the next city's triumphant with their deity, and therefore, our deity trumps your deity. So all of these gods,
and then you take the statue of the deity to your city, because now you have defeated the deity. And you see that in Assyrian reliefs. You see Assyrian soldiers with statues on their shoulders.
Yes. Well, yeah. Looting has always been the same. Thinking Sulla and Nero, you're like, that's exactly the same. But it's also interesting because very often the earliest depictions we have of this equipment we're talking about, whether it be bows, spears, helmets, shields, they are in the context of surviving statues of or reliefs of those gods. And then every now and then we find a rare example of a real thing. Oh, and the plain old soldier's helmet, like the Hittite one that we talk about in the issue, matches the ones shown on the storm god reliefs at the Hittite capital. So it's like, and then it becomes a chicken egg argument. Is the warrior god depicted because that's the equipment worn by Hittite soldiers, or do Hittite soldiers wear the equipment which is worn by the warrior god?
I don't know. It just makes Trajan's column so disappointing.
They all could be the personification of Mars, I suppose.
Well, I just mean that, what's on there equipment-wise never matches what we find.
No, that's true. Very true. Very true. And it's, I think that's also fascinating in terms of the symbolism, which, goes through various rounds of interpretation. What does the symbol mean? Oh, we think the symbol means that. In the last issue, of course, we talked about helmets, which is a perfect discussion of the continuity and ubiquity of a piece of equipment, regardless of the variations in style across cultures. It still has to protect a head, and human heads don't really alter that much across time, to the point that we can put on an ancient helmet today. And so that idea of, this bolt here, the crest here, the horn here, they are in fact mirrored in the sculpture and the real surviving examples to some degree. There seems to be variation, whether it be manufacture or personal choice or decoration or not. But there's that fascinating symbolism. And again, what you get on some of these very elaborate, probably kingly helmets is, gods and deities and monsters and personifications of things acting out battle and hunting scenes. Again, very common on helmet decoration is this hunting scene, which is that connection. Again, it's all interconnected, which unfortunately is a lifetime's work for one culture, let alone all of them.
On that bombshell, see you next time.